We're going to be working with positioning elements next. And basically, when positioning was first introduced with CSS, designers were very excited because they thought they could basically create web pages that were similar to their favorite page layout programs. And then with just a couple CSS properties, they could position an element precisely on the page. Unfortunately, the level of control that designers expected from CSS positioning never really materialized. And the reason why is because there's a difference in how the various browsers display CSS positioned elements. It's not uniform across all browsers. And also, the real fundamental reason is that the web doesn't work like a printed brochure or a magazine or a book. Web pages are more fluid than printed pages. There's many things that can change. The user can change the size of the browser, resolution values change, the size of the text that the user requests can be changed. So all of these things, of course, are going to affect where items are going to be positioned on the page. So as long as you don't expect to be able to dictate the exact width, height, and position of every design element, you'll probably find that the CSS positioning properties to be very useful and very powerful and helpful. You can basically use these properties to make text caption appear on top of a photo. You can create multi-column page layouts. You can place a logo anywhere on the page, and much, much more. You do need to be careful, though, when you use CSS positioning, because as I mentioned before, it is not completely uniform on all browsers, and IE6 has some problems with positioning, so I'll point those things out as we go about learning more about positioning. But basically, how positioning properties work is the CSS positioning property lets us control how and where a web browser displays particular elements. Using position, you can place like a sidebar, for instance, anywhere you wish on a page. You can make sure that the navigation bar at the top of the page stays in place even when the visitor scrolls down, and there's many other things that you can achieve using positioning. There's basically 4 types of positioning. There is static, relative, absolute, and fixed. So let's go ahead and talk about some more of all 4 of these positioning attributes and see how they work in conjunction together. I'm going to go ahead and use an example to introduce the concept of positioning. Here is my XHTML document, and this is what it looks like in the browser. It basically is very simple. It's just 4 paragraphs. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to go ahead and leave paragraphs 1, 2, and 4 at their default static position. Static position is the default position property. We're going to be altering the position property of paragraph 3. And what we're going to do in order to do that is we're going to create a special class that will apply to this one paragraph so that we can change the position of this paragraph without affecting the other paragraphs. So static positioning, which I mentioned before, is the default positioning. And basically each element is simply laid out one after another so that the paragraphs appear to be one under the next with their default margins, creating space between each other. And in this particular web page, I haven't defined any styles, so the default margin that the paragraphs have is displaying at this point. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to change a box's positioning property so that we can see how positioning works. So I'm going to come up here to my base style, and here's paragraph 3. We'll go ahead and we'll just assign a class to it, and I'm going to go ahead and call my class, let's call it special, not spatial, but special seems better, special para. And actually, yeah, we'll call this special para. Then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define some different values about my special paragraph. So up here in my style, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a style for special para. I'll open and close my curly braces just like we've done in the past. And then I'll go about setting my CSS styles. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the property of position, and I'm going to go ahead and define the position for this first one to be relative. I'm going to go ahead and set the top value to 30 pixels, and let's get that 0 in there so it actually is 30, and I'll go ahead and set the left value to 20 pixels. Now, when you are setting your different position, when using positioning, you basically have the properties of top, left, bottom, and right. Normally, just providing the values for top and left is going to produce the results you want. As a matter of fact, if you use bottom and right, pretty much all the browsers support it except for IE6, which totally ignores positioning on right and bottom. So essentially it becomes useless since there's still a huge market that is viewing web pages on IE6. So my recommendation to you is that you don't really use right and bottom since they're not going to be fully supported. Let's go ahead and let's save our page and let's see how it looks in the browser if we reload the page. You can now see that paragraph 3 has been moved. It's actually overlying on top of paragraph 4. And basically, the top of the paragraph is moved down 30 pixels and it's moved over to the left by 20 pixels. The element is basically moving relative to its original position. Nothing else on the page has changed. The space that was occupied by the original static element is retained as in relationship to the position of the other elements on the page. The thing to remember here is that if you move an element in this way, you need to allow space for it. So here, since I've moved this down and now it's sitting on top of the 4th paragraph, it doesn't become very usable. You can also see where this gap appears where my original image was. Essentially, when you're using relative positioning, you can move an element from its default position, but this space it originally occupied or retained is going to leave a hole where the element would have been. The main benefit of relative positioning isn't necessarily to move an element, but it's to set a new point of reference for absolutely positioned elements that are nested inside of this. And we'll be talking more about this, and I'll show you some examples of this in a future lecture. So this is how relative positioning is going to affect the paragraph. Let's explore some of the other positioning values. So we're going to move on to absolute positioning. Absolute positioning is a whole different animal from static and relative, since this type of positioning takes an element entirely out of the flow of the document. So let's see what happens when we change that. So all of these settings I'm going to go ahead and leave exactly the same, except I will go ahead and change my position to absolute. Let's save the page and we'll refresh the page here. And you can see what's happening. Now my paragraph 3, let's make the text in paragraph 3 a different color so that we can just easily see what's going on here as well. So let me just make that red. You can now see that paragraph 3, which is the red text, has moved up and over. You can see that the space that was originally occupied by that paragraph 3 is gone, and the absolute position has basically become entirely dependent on the surrounding elements in the markup. It's now basically going to be positioned with respect to the top level element. And in this situation, our top level element of the paragraph is the body tag. So it's actually moving paragraph 3 30 pixels from the top and 20 pixels from the left. So it's going to always be positioned with respect to the top level element. And by default, that's going to be the body unless your top level element is something else. And that would require that you nest tags. The most important concept of positioning contexts, which is going to be a reoccurring subject that we'll be covering throughout this course, is the default positioning context of an absolutely positioned element is the body element. Because the absolutely positioned element's positioning context is the body, the element moves when the page is scrolled to retain its relationship to the body. So if I go back to my browser right here and we resize our page, you're going to see that as I scroll, it's always going to keep its original positioning. So it works similarly to how most objects would basically work in a browser. as I scroll down or move my page around, it floats, but it always stays 30 pixels from the top and 20 pixels from the left. It is possible to use different elements other than the body as the positioning context for absolutely positioned elements, and this becomes a very powerful way to use absolutely positioned elements. In addition, absolutely positioned elements are completely detached from the flow of the page as determined by the HTML code. And what I'm saying, in other words, is other things on the page don't even know that the absolutely positioned element exists. They can even disappear completely underneath absolutely positioned items if we aren't careful. And you can kind of see this happening. If I was to go ahead and define a background color for this paragraph, it would basically obscure the paragraph that was underneath it. So if we go ahead and set these settings and we reload the page, you can see that the paragraph 1 is being totally obscured. Absolute positioned elements are going to take pretense of elements on your page, and they basically will obscure them if that becomes the case. So you need to be careful when using absolutely positioned elements, and you need to fully understand how they work so that you can use them correctly. The next positioning property that we're going to be talking about is fixed positioning. Fixed positioning is very similar to absolute positioning, except that the element's positioning context is the viewport, which basically in this case is going to be the browser window. So the element does not necessarily move when the page is scrolled. So let's go ahead and let's just change this to fixed, and I'll leave my colors in there. I'll refresh the page. So looking at the page, it looks exactly the same. If I am to make the page smaller so that I have scrolling, you can see that my fixed element stays on the page. The rest of the text is moving behind the fixed element. It is always staying 30 pixels from the top and 20 pixels from the left, no matter what size my browser window is, and no matter where I'm scrolling. It always stays in relationship to that 30 pixels and 20 pixels from the left in relationship to the actual browser window. This basically creates a more kind of nailed to the browser effect, enables you to simulate the effect of what frames once did. Frames are deprecated, and so you can simulate this effect, which is very, very cool because you can create a navigation element that stays put when the rest of the page scrolls, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of managing multiple documents in a frame set. Unfortunately, this seems like such a great idea, and it basically is, but unfortunately the fixed position does not work in IE 6 and below for the PC. So there are some workarounds, and we'll be discussing those a little bit later on, but do keep in mind that fixed can be a little bit tricky since IE 6 doesn't recognize it. Pesky little IE 6 always throws a wrench in things because it's probably the most widely used and least supportive browser of CSS. They've definitely made some leaps in IE 7, but as you'll see, as you start to do more complex things with CSS, there definitely are some issues about which browsers support which CSS properties, and you'll eventually probably have to use some sort of workarounds to get your page to work in all browsers. But we'll just kind of move on from that right now. So now you can see how the 4 positioning settings work. If I was to set this to static, I didn't actually plug that in there, but basically static is going to give us a web page that looks just like it did in the beginning, where the paragraph is going to stay in its original position and it just acts like the regular paragraph that it is. The only time you're really ever going to be using static is when you want to bring an item that has previously been assigned another positioning value back to the default positioning. So there's not a lot of instances when you'll be using the static position property. So now we've done a little overview of how the positioning properties work. Positioning context is an important concept to grasp because if you want to truly escape from table-based layouts, then you'll need to use positioning. You don't always need to use positioning. As a matter of fact, you can achieve really great results a lot of times without using positioning, but you certainly will use it sometimes, and you'll need to understand how it works. So hopefully this simple example has introduced you to the 4 positioning properties. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore how positioning works and discuss some techniques where we can do some things using positioning, and we'll kind of combine some of the positioning properties like I alluded to earlier.